With unity, we were trying to make sure that everything in the composition looked like it belonged. With balance, what we're doing is thinking about those differences, what we could describe as visual weight, and thinking about the distribution of the visual weight across the picture plane. For our purposes, we're going to talk about visual weight essentially as it's something you want to look at. We'll talk more about that when we talk about emphasis next week. For right now, what we're going to do is think more about the distribution. With balance, we're thinking about playing one aspect of visual weight within the composition against another. We're going to start with the most simple form of balance, which is what's known as symmetrical balance. With symmetrical balance, it's the same on both sides, but then that raises the question, both sides of what? Most of the time when we're thinking about balance, we're thinking about balance right and left on a vertical axis. With symmetry, we have exactly the same thing on both sides. We could, theoretically, have horizontal axis symmetry, where we're drawing a horizontal line and talking about whether or not there's the same amount of visual information on the top and the bottom. But we tend to not care about that one as much because gravity. We're used to there being a lot of extra stuff on the bottom of our field of vision. Really, the only time anybody notices horizontal axis symmetry is when we have a whole lot of stuff at the top because it's unexpected. We could also have what's called center axis symmetry, where we have both a vertical axis and a horizontal axis, and it's the same on top and bottom and left and right. Radial symmetry is truly defined as it's the same on both sides no matter where you draw the line. Although ironically, my example of that is not radially symmetrical because you couldn't have a rectangle like this. You'd have to have a square so that if I draw the line here, I don't have nothing to balance out the other side. What's good about symmetry? Well, for one thing, it's balanced. If I have exactly the same thing on both sides, it's definitely going to be balanced. It's also really clear in terms of visual hierarchy. I know what the most important thing is. It's almost always the thing in the middle. It's really stable. Symmetry is also natural. You spend most of your time in a symmetrical body, and we look at the way in which things in nature grow. It's typically symmetrical. But one thing that we have to acknowledge is that too much symmetry can actually start to look artificial or stilted or forced. When we're looking at even this example of how we are trapped in human bodies that are symmetrical, you can see there are slight variations. The eyebrows are a little bit different. The hair is a little bit different. One ear is a slightly different color. What we find then is that too much symmetry can kind of freak us out. What artists will often do then is create asymmetrical compositions, compositions that are not exactly the same on both sides. But this example by Veneziano is a good sample of something where they're still trying to get all of the positive benefits of a symmetrical composition. What's the most important thing in the composition? Well, it's the baby Jesus and the Virgin Mary. The architecture frames them. Their skin tone is so similar, they're literally touching. They're in such close proximity. They're framed and separated from the other elements in such a way that I kind of read it as one gestalt, one unit. What I think is interesting about looking at this is thinking about how the artist is achieving balance asymmetrically and where my eye goes, how I move through the composition. So yes, I do look at the Virgin and Child, but I pretty quickly start to drift away, especially because baby Jesus is looking over here. I think John the Baptist, represented here by his hair shirt and the tan that he got by wandering in the desert, is going to be my next place to go, even if Jesus isn't looking over there, because he has a number of things that give him more visual weight. The strong color in a big area definitely gets us to pay attention to him. He also, because of that tan, has more contrast of value with the background than any of the other figures. But perhaps most importantly, he's looking right at us. And it's important to remember that conceptual concerns can have a big impact on the visual weight that we see within an image. I am going to pay more attention to a face that is looking right at me than I am somebody who isn't engaging with me. Certain things have psychological impact that cause me to notice them more. He has one of the least subtle compositional devices in all of art history, which is the way in which John the Baptist is redirecting our gaze. No, don't look at me, go back to Jesus. What's especially appropriate about this is that that's the role that John the Baptist plays in the Bible. He essentially acts as the herald to Christ, so that he comes along to prepare the way before we move back to Jesus. The more worldly concerns of the image might attract our attention initially, but John the Baptist is trying to get us to go back to Jesus. Unfortunately for him, though, I've already looked at Jesus and he wasn't, oh, okay, I'm going to come over here. So what's likely is that I'm going to start in the center, move to John the Baptist, and then jump over to this figure. This is Saint Zenobius. He, along with John the Baptist, is one of the two patron saints of Florence. Saint Zenobius was the first bishop of Florence. He essentially brought Christianity to Florence, Italy. And we can see the way in which he is a softened version of John the Baptist in terms of visual weight. We have all of the same elements that we have with John the Baptist, but diluted. The tan that was John the Baptist becomes the gold embroidery on the clerical vestments of Saint Zenobius. The red of John the Baptist's fabulous handkerchief gets divided up into small panels within the robes. Even his gesture is similar but softer. Saint Zenobius is enacting a blessing, but his hand doesn't distract because his gloves blend in with the column behind him so well. I'm likely to continue drifting over. And here we have St. Lucy herself, the one for whom the altarpiece is named. What's interesting is the way in which Veneziano is using her figure almost as a bracket. We've got the color repetition of that pink so that we are still connecting her with the center of the image. And then her body is turned so that we don't just drift past her and out of the composition. In fact, we're likely to follow her gaze all the way back across and engage with this figure. This figure is interesting compositionally because it's almost as if Veneziano is going out of his way to minimize him. He's not looking out at us. He's looking down at this Book of Hours. The Book of Hours red cover is going to blend in with the pink of the background and also be sublimated to the more orange, higher intensity red that we have on John the Baptist. It's almost as if Veneziano is trying his hardest to dial down our interest in this figure, which in a way makes sense, because if we go back to that idea that there are certain elements that have conceptual weight that gives them visual weight, this guy is one of them. He is St. Francis, a hugely popular figure